You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to the Catholic Mama, where you'll learn how to deepen and defend your faith, find comfort as we share the vocation of parenthood, and learn how to raise your children confidently Catholic. I'm your host, Christine Mooney Flynn. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Catholic Mama podcast. I'm your host, Christine Mooney Flynn, and thanks for joining me on this episode where I get to talk to John DeRosa, who is the podcast host of Classic Theism. He's actually a good friend of my husband's, and his wife and I share the same name, so obviously a great guy. He's a Catholic. Are you a lifelong Catholic, John, as I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll let you talk about yourself in just a minute, but I'm excited to get to talk to you about your new book that's coming out, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, about how we kind of tackle these slogans that you hear atheists say online, which, I mean, if you spend 2 seconds on any blog post or any Facebook post written by somebody who believes in God or somebody who doesn't believe in God, these slogans seem to come up. So, man, and it's sometimes they're pretty hard to refute quickly if you don't have the right words or the right logic behind it. So I'm excited to get to talk about that. But first of all, let me just say thank you for joining me on my show today.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's great to finally talk to you. I've talked to Pat Flynn. He's like been my philosophy buddy over the past year. I just call him up and ask him a bunch of questions, and he's like, "Oh, my wife Christine has a podcast too." I'm like, "Oh, wow, that's." Two things are great about that. One, my wife's name is Christine, and two, maybe that's another place. He kind of might have pushed you to have me on the podcast, but I'm happy to be here to talk about the new book.
Awesome. So, I'm always excited to talk to different guests, and that's been like the coolest thing about doing a podcast. And I know you have one, so you know it too. You want to talk to people that typically you would not have gotten the chance to have a conversation with.
That's honestly my favorite part. So as people may or may not know, but I host the Classical Theism podcast, but that's not my full-time job or anything. I'm just a high school math teacher in New Jersey, but I've been so interested in these questions about Catholicism and faith and apologetics and stuff on the side that I'm like, oh man, why don't I start a podcast? And I bring on, great guests and great experts and help them explain to us more about the faith. And yeah, that's kind of one of my favorite parts of podcasting. It's just all the great people you meet and people you can learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, look at this. We have a high school math teacher from New Jersey, a wife and mother sitting in a basement in Wisconsin. We're going to talk about how to refute atheism. Actually, I was stalking you a little bit on your website, and I think I saw your wedding anniversary is April 22nd.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, that's my birthday.
Oh my gosh.
Wasn't that crazy? Your wife's name's Christine. You guys got married on my birthday. I'm Chris. And then we have Gary Machuda, who's a friend of yours and Pat's and mine, and his wife's name is Christine as well.
And I'll tell you what, and Gary Machuda is not disconnected from this because he's actually the one who pushed me to publish this in a book form, because it started out as an ebook, and I had 10 slogans and then 12 slogans and 13 slogans, and I kept adding to it, and I could talk more about that. But then Gary's like, John, why don't you just compile this into a book? You keep adding to it. So I'm like, oh, Gary, it's a great idea. And Pat, Gary, and I have done some work together, and yeah, we love to joke. All our wives are named Christine, and yeah, we've appreciated our friendship, getting to work together, and I'm excited to talk with you about the book today.
Yeah, well, I've been on Gary's show, and he's been on mine, and so it's only fitting that I get to close the triangle or close the loop with the husbands, the Christine husbands. So, okay, you touched on the fact that you have a podcast, Classical Theism. Tell us a little bit more about yourself before we get into tackling atheism.
So I'm a lifelong Catholic. I was born and raised a Catholic, and I remember praying and learning about the faith growing up, but it didn't really sink into my life in a deep way until college. So growing up, I kind of like to say I had more of a fideistic faith. I kind of just did it because I was supposed to do it. I went to church. I did pray, and I did believe, and I had what I would consider some religious experience, but I never fully engaged the faith at an intellectual level, and I wasn't really required to until college. So I went to the College of New Jersey, which is a secular university, liberal arts school, and even as a freshman, my freshman year, there was this big hubbub about a famous atheist, Christopher Hitchens, who came to debate a Christian named Frank Turek on my college campus. So people were all hyped up about this, and I never even knew, that people took this stuff so seriously, that there were people really like supporting the atheist side. And I was like, I don't even know how to place all this, because I had never really considered, tough objections to your view, or that there were people who weren't like me in my little bubble in New Jersey. So long story short, I found out about the apologetics group on campus, and we had a really holy priest, Father Bill, and he kind of led this once a week group in apologetics, which was how to explain and defend the faith. And I just learned about that, and I was really drawn in. But he was also really good because he taught us pastorally, like the importance of prayer and your relationship with God. And so I really credit a lot of my falling deeper in love with the Catholicism to Father Bill, because he helped me do that. And then ever since then, I've kind of just been more engaged with like studying it on the side and reading books. And I just wanted to know more and learn more. You probably know this yourself as a convert, that like once you find out a little bit about what's in the Catholic tradition, you just want to find out more and more.
Yeah. I was thinking about that the other day. It's kind of like when you say you move to a new city, and suddenly, you just want to know everything about the city, and you're going to places that even lifelong residents be like, what? That's in our city? I've come across so many Catholics who said, wait, what? That's it, that prayer is called that? Or I didn't know that. It's just because you're plopped into something new, or if you rediscover it, it's brand new in that sense.
Exactly. And for me, that was just like going to college surrounded by people who didn't necessarily share, Catholic viewpoints or were even antagonistic to it. I was forced to kind of grapple with these things for the first time. And at first, I was uncomfortable with it. Like, oh, geez, what am I going to do with all these objections? But over time, it actually came to bolster my faith even more. And that's kind of what my podcast is about. So we defend Catholic Christian ideas in conversation, but we're not like yelling and screaming or any of that. I am not, a personal expert or anything myself. I'm just a math teacher who's interested in this stuff, but I bring on great guests and philosophers and other people to teach us how to have better conversations about the faith. That's
awesome. Yeah, I grew up, like I mentioned before we hit record, I grew up in North Carolina. And so there was a lot of yelling and screaming about the faith from some Bible belters, and it really was a turnoff. So to have intelligent conversations and actually have good reasons, rather, because I used to think that people who were faithful, that I wish I could be that naive. That must be nice for them, and had no idea that there was actually really, really good reasons, and really, really smart people have figured all this out. Besides what we can get to through revelation, which is a lot, but you can also get pretty far in just with deep armchair thinking even.
Absolutely. No, and it's meeting some of those great Catholics and learning from them and reading their books that stirred me on to learn more. But actually, this would be a good time. Could I add a little bit about what sparked the slogan idea? Is that, and this will kind of lead into the title.
Perfect.
I kept hearing these slogans so the book's called One Less God Than You, because I kept seeing like these slogans being slung around, whether on the internet or on TV or on a late night talk show. Even Ricky Gervais, who's an atheist and is a comedian. He's actually, a funny comedian. A lot of people like him, but he's also an atheist. He was on Stephen Colbert's show, and he used like this famous objection, like, oh, you don't believe in Thor, you don't believe in Zeus, you don't believe in 2,999 other gods. Why don't you just be consistent, Stephen Colbert? And Stephen Colbert is actually a Catholic. And he's like, why don't you just be consistent and go one God further? As an atheist, I just go one God further and reject, all gods. And you should do the same if you want to be consistent. And it's slogans like that, which aren't necessarily the strongest arguments, but like it gets a cheer from the crowd. And, sometimes people just like to assert, well, there's no evidence for God's existence. And as an atheist, I want to follow evidence. So that's why I don't believe in God. And a slogan like that, those two I just read are kind of the first two in the book. There's no evidence, and I believe in one less God. They can be pretty disconcerting to a Christian, but they can also be powerful, if you're in a group, or even if you're just talking with someone, a friend who just, doesn't believe anymore. They can be pretty powerful, and I think people tend to panic when they hear them. So one of the things I wanted to do with this book is not set out to refute everything that's ever been written, as if that could be done in one book, but rather to give Catholics some confidence and some conversation starters. This is what you can say. These are the types of questions you can ask to maybe help that conversation get off on the right foot, because I don't want to be the person who's yelling and screaming at the street preacher. I don't want to be someone who's typing in all caps on Facebook. I just want to have, a good conversation and share with someone, what's been valuable to me, and hopefully lead them closer to the Lord. So what I do for each of the slogans is kind of teach you some principles and some questions you can ask that will move the conversation forward. And another tip I give in the intro is just, this should not be disconnected from prayer. And if your sons or daughters, or even if you are going to be engaging with skeptics and atheists and so forth, you want to stay close to the Lord, and you want to make sure you pray every day, because it can be a bit draining, and you don't want to put too much on your shoulders. What I think is, a lot of people think, oh man, unless I have the perfect answer and can, convert my son or convert their friend, or unless I can do this, perfectly, well, then it's not worth doing. And that's just not the case. Actually, there's a famous quote from G.K. Chesterton where he's like, anything worth doing is worth doing badly. And I don't want you to do this badly, but I want to give people some encouragement that you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know everything. If you know just a little bit about how to start the conversation and you have a good prayer life, then you can make progress when talking to atheists or skeptics.
That's awesome. I'm excited to read this, because there are times, even if, as a Christian, you might look at one of those slogans and be like, I know it's wrong, but I just don't know how to verbalize that.
Absolutely.
And to have some quick hitter things without feeling overwhelmed that you have to suddenly be a philosophy or theology expert, just to have some idea that you can either, even if you're not going to outwardly start defending it or having that conversation with the person who said the slogan, at least you can defend your any doubts that arise in your own life because of it.
Well, you just nailed it right there, because people, when they hear something like this, they think they need to they just need to launch into a defense and start defending everything and spewing counter arguments on the spot. And that is absolutely not the case. So the second principle I give in the introduction, the first one is just prayer. But the second one I say is, whenever possible, ask questions rather than make statements. And this is what I learned from other Christians. There's a guy, an evangelical Christian named Greg Kokel, who does a really good job talking to atheists. And then, of course, Trent Horn in the Catholic world is really famous for this, great conversations. But they say, just pause for a moment and ask some questions. And even if you're not sure what to ask, there's 3 general questions that you can ask in pretty much any conversation after you hear a slogan. And the 3 I give in the intro, it's just, just ask the person for clarification. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
How did you come to that conclusion? Tell me more about your reasoning. And then a third one that maybe you need to work a little bit more to get to is just, instead of firing back a counter argument, you say, well, I hear that, but have you considered this? And then maybe you can offer something from your own viewpoint. So those are the 3 starter questions. Just, what do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? And have you ever considered this? And then what I do is, for each of the 20 chapters, I kind of give you some more specific questions that you can ask in each individual context.
All right. So say you're online or you're at the Thanksgiving dinner table with your family, and somebody comes up with the first slogan or something similar. So there is evidence for God's existence, but a lot of times, Christians don't know that there is actually good evidence, and maybe even apart, say from. I think a lot of atheists will say, well, the Bible doesn't count as good enough evidence. So how do you start? Besides these questions that you could ask back to the person who's claiming this.
Yeah, so let's say someone says there's no evidence for God's existence and the Bible doesn't count. I just added your little extra onto that first one, because you could hear that. First of all, if it's at the Thanksgiving dinner table, try to remain calm. I don't know what I would say in that situation, but as far as in particular contexts where you're with family members, that's tough. I admit that that's tough, because I'll tell you what, if I'm arguing with my brother and my sister who know all the things that are wrong with me and that I've done wrong in the past, tensions are just high, and relationships are going to be a little different with family. I got a great tip one time from a guy who just said, pray for someone else to come into their life that can teach them, because they're not going to listen to you. So sometimes that can be tough with a family member.
Maybe a Friendsgiving then.
Yeah, there you go. Let's engage it, though, still. But at a substantial level, we can always engage it. So say someone says there's no evidence for God's existence and the Bible doesn't count. Here's my first question back to them. I would start with a question. I wouldn't start just listing out evidence because then it's easy for them to just swipe it all down. But I would say, hey, you say there's no evidence. What's the best evidence you've heard? And what do you think is wrong with it? Ask that question. I remember that question, practice that one. What's the best evidence you've heard, and what do you think is wrong with it? And then, in your mind, you can immediately categorize what they say, because they're going to give basically 3 different forms of an answer, or 3 different categories that I go through. One is they're going to say, well, I've never heard any evidence for God's existence. And if that's the case, then you can respond and say, really? You've never heard anything at all? Because I can think of at least 2 or 3 good reasons to believe in God, and that's going to require some previous study on your part. And in an appendix in the book, I go through 5 reasons, but you could say something like, really, you've never heard any evidence? Because I could think of at least 4 or 5 good reasons to believe in God. I mean, God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. God explains why there's contingent things that exist at all. He can explain why our reason, which transcends purely material processes, can help us find truth. Also, he is the best example or best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for human life. And 5th, he really grounds objective moral facts that everyone holds to. And those are like just 5 arguments that I kind of go through more in the appendix. But my book there's been individual books written on all of those arguments to get into. But my thing is, if they say they've never heard anything, you could say, oh man, well, I can think of at least 2 or 3 things. And those will be based on your previous study. But more likely, they're not going to say they haven't heard anything. More likely, they're going to start either giving what I call weak evidence, or they might give stronger evidence and have an issue with it. If they give the weak evidence, they might say, oh man, well, like one time, okay, best evidence, one time my friend told me like he prayed for something and then he got a job. And he's like, see, man, God exists. And you know what? I don't deny that can be very strong evidence. And in fact, I think religious experience can be very powerful. But if someone says that, like something very subjectively based, then I would say, you know what? I agree with you. That's not really a clear objective reason to believe in God. But have you considered this other stuff? And that's where you give a few more of your additional evidences. And then the third type, and I'll let you come back on this in a minute, is if they give strong evidence, like let's say, well, I'll tell you what, I've looked into the Kalam cosmological argument, and I think it has this flaw, and they lay that out. Well, that's an atheist who's done some of his or her homework, and you should commend that. Because I'll tell you what, 9 times out of 10, they are not going to say that. They're going to say there's nothing, or they're going to talk about some weird story or the Bible. But 9 times out of 10, but if you do hear that, you should say, hey, I got to be honest, that is a really good objection. It shows that you've looked into the evidence. And if you know the answer, you can give it. And if you don't, you could say, well, I'm going to look into that, and then I'll get back to you. Another question I list there is you could say back, it's kind of a little cheeky, but is it really plausible that there's no evidence when many professors and highly trained scholars have written peer-reviewed articles and papers defending God's existence? Is it really plausible that there's nothing? That's kind of a cheeky response, but I think
if you know the person really well and you have a good rapport, that you can get away with something like that.
Exactly. But just to make it simple, don't just start firing off evidence. Instead, draw something out. You want to find out, what did they study? So ask them, what's the best evidence you've heard? What do you think is wrong with it? And then that can lead into further discussions down the line.
Yeah. Well, I like that, because a lot of times, if you ask, there's a friend of mine a long time ago, when not a long time, I've only been Catholic for like 2.5 years, but a while back, when she had heard that my husband and I were converting, said, why, how can you believe any of that stuff? And if at first, I think we just, it wasn't a directed conversation, like it wasn't corralled in any sense, and suddenly you're going down this rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and this and that, and just things that they didn't like that they encountered with a Christian when they were 10 or something, and to put the questions back on them and get answers can really direct the conversation, rather than it going into some tirade and filled with tangents.
Absolutely. And I'll say, even I was guilty of this the other week. Like, someone posted on a Pints of Aquinas YouTube video like an objection, and I was like answering it, and I wrote like 3 paragraphs, and then the person just responded. They're like, dude, do you think I'm really going to take that seriously? Like the person didn't even want to engage at that level, but I was already like launching into a defense. And so the point is, take a step back, realize where the person is coming from, and then you'll be able to provide a more helpful answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I got to say, sometimes I do respond to people and comments online simply because it's not that I think I'm going to get them to engage in a meaningful conversation, but just to, put it out there for anybody who may be peeping in from the sidelines, because you never know who's watching.
That's a good reason to do apologetics is one, it could help bolster your own faith, but two, it can help other Catholics around who are listening and want to just hear, if there's some good answers.
Right, because they might be in the position where they know there is a proof for God's existence or evidence for God's existence, but they don't know how to articulate it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This idea, and I know, Ricky Gervais has some fun. He comes up in memes, and he's got some funny jokes. But yeah, he is a raging atheist, and he's not afraid to talk about how silly he thinks that belief in God is. So it's interesting that you bring up that Stephen Colbert episode. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, and it's just it's very good one-liners, and it makes people. But you got to investigate it. So okay, he says, "I believe in one less God than you do." So shouldn't we just be consistent and reject all the rest? And so what I suggest someone ask, and there's two things I suggest. One, well, you could ask a question. You could say, "Hey, do you really think all of those gods are the same? And if so, you can you explain that to me?" And they might say, "Yeah, they're all the same because there's no evidence for any of them." And if that's the case, then you're back to that first slogan that we just discussed. And you can ask, well, what's the best evidence you've heard? But another way to go about this, I like this, is just make an analogy to something like a crime being committed. And so let's say a crime is committed and so I like this, I write this analogy in the book, but a crime is committed, someone stole a diamond necklace, and the police round up a bunch of different suspects. But they keep rounding up these suspects, and then they dismiss them. He's got an alibi, or he clearly was somewhere else, and he was seen on camera, nowhere near the place. They dismiss these suspects one after one. But then they find a guy, and they have really good evidence that he did it. They got his fingerprints. They got camera footage. He's near the scene. He was found holding the necklace later on that day. And they bring him in, and one of the detectives is like, "Guys, we can't arrest this guy. We've let 100 different people go. All right. I just believe in one less criminal than you do. Obviously, he can't be guilty." Would anyone take that person seriously in the situation? And hopefully not. Just because 100 people aren't guilty doesn't mean that one person can go free, or that one person isn't the culprit. So the way I formulate it in the book is I tell that story, and then I just say, remember this principle. Lack of evidence for some gods does not mean there's no evidence for any God. And in particular, on my podcast, we get into a lot of classical theism, and the God of classical theism is not like the finite, mutable gods of other religions. He's not like Zeus or Thor, who have all these emotions and fly off the handle and are, having romantic relationships with other gods that are really just like super human beings, but like in the sky and can fly around with greater superpowers. The God of classical theism is not like that. No, he's the necessary creator of all that exists. And even if there's no evidence for those other types of gods, it doesn't mean that there's no evidence for this God. And that's how I would kind of move the conversation forward.
Yeah, that's very good. I mean, it's difficult with debating anti-religious. I would say, I don't think people who are anti-Catholic, I don't think their slogans are as catchy, but atheists seem to have some catchy slogans. We're like, oh, huh.
Everybody's got catchy slogans.
Yeah,
they can be drawn to them. And, I think it's good for us too. We shouldn't love a slogan just because it's on our side. If somebody's making like a silly argument, then it's hard not to engage with it. But I agree, it's fun. Like, I don't fault some of these skeptics sometimes for repeating what Ricky Gervais says, because it is fun, and it sounds like, oh man, like they're making this big point. But let's analyze it. Let's go deeper, and it doesn't really show anything at all.
Yeah, right. Because the gods, whether it's the millions of Hindu gods or the gods of ancient Rome, like you said, they're not. They don't hold a candle to what we know is true as Christians.
Absolutely.
This is a very, very.
Can I give one more question? Here's another question you might ask in a slightly different context, but I think it applies to this one too. I like to ask people, well, hey, if you're looking at the Mona Lisa, where's the painter? If you were looking at the Mona Lisa, where's the painter? And they can say, well, the painter, he's not he's not in the painting itself. He's not like at some subatomic particle level. You can't find him in the corner. You can't find him over in the top right. You can't even find him, underneath the canvas hiding. The painter is the necessary creator and the orderer and the designer of there being a painting itself. So a lot of times when these atheists give the objection, well, I just believe in one less God than you do, they're conceiving of God almost as if he is another creature or another little, he's powerful, but he's just like us, alongside us. And they look out into the sky, they look underneath the earth, they look under the microscope, and they don't see him, and they infer that he doesn't exist. But that's not the type of being he is at all. All right, he is radically different from us, but he's the reason that the universe exists at all, that has the ordering that it does for intelligent life, that we have these objective moral facts that we find ourselves with. So he's just in a different category than these other gods.
Right. Yeah. He's not supposed to be seen. Yeah. I love that about the painter. I've heard something similar, like, if you read a book, you're not seeing the writer in the book. Yeah. That's a really
that's
great
another
point,
good analogy to draw. Exactly. He's more like the author of the story. The author isn't a character within the story, but he's the reason that there is any story that exists at all.
Yeah. And there's good evidence. I mean, it's not like you just look at a book and be like, well, it just came into existence. I don't know how it got here.
Right.
The painting just shows up. Well, it's here now. That's good enough for me.
Exactly right. And I will say, because some people are like, well, I only want to read a book on those arguments and those evidence. I do give resources at the end of each chapter. So I give some resources for if you want to go further. And I have an appendix where I summarize 5 of the arguments. But like I said, there's been whole books written on those. You can listen to Pat's podcast, or actually the one where you guys discuss some arguments. That was really good. But in each of these chapters, I'm going to tell you exactly what you could say in conversation to help respond. Which
is great, because it can be very daunting, the idea of having to assimilate all this information into your own repertoire and then spit it back out in a conversational way. So, I mean, you've done most of the work for people, which is awesome.
Right, and it just came from me making so many mistakes and seeing all these slogans. So, yeah,
it's very helpful. I mean, you mentioned Trent Horn earlier. I've definitely I fell back very heavily on, and I'm blanking on the name of the book, but his book about engaging pro-choice.
Oh, Persuasive Pro-Life. Yes.
Thank you. That's it. Yeah, he made it so simple for me to actually do. And I last summer, I spent a lot of time between Disney and Netflix saying that they were going to fight any of the heartbeat bills and all that stuff. So I spent a lot of time, more than I would have ever thought, because I'm not a natural debater, doing this stuff online. I did make a lot of mistakes, but it was very helpful to have. I mean, once I got on board with what Trent, his way of doing things, everything went a lot more smoothly. And I don't know if I changed anybody's minds, or at least I was a bit more ecumenical.
Absolutely. Well, and that's the thing. Like, no one has to be a trained debater. I'm not a trained debater. I'm not a super expert or anything. But if we offer something more, Trent Horn uses the phrase, you put a pebble in their shoe, give them something more to think about. You ask some good questions, whether it's on the pro-life issue, whether it's on the atheism and theism issue. You can be a step in that person's path toward God, even if you don't see it at the time. Maybe it comes years later with the Holy Spirit working all these different things in their life. So God can use you even if you're not, Mr. Debate expert. That's not what I want people. I wrote this book for everyone, for any Catholic Christian who wants to defend Catholic Christian ideas. It's really for the level of, hey, I totally forgot to tell this story, but I'll be brief. I ran a confirmation class, or I volunteered for a confirmation retreat. And these 8th and 9th graders that were getting ready to make their confirmation, a lot of them had these skeptical objections. And they were either giving these slogans themselves, or they were like writing them down as questions, because this is what they were hearing from friends who, heard they're going to be confirmed, or, why do you believe any of that stuff? So guess what? Our young people can make use of this material as well. So I think the book is going to be helpful for regular Catholics in the pew who want to be able to engage others. And also it could be for people at that confirmation age who are asking those tough questions.
That's such a good point. Yeah, because I was asked recently what I thought was the biggest issue that Catholic or families were facing today. And it's really a world that will waste no time in telling you that your faith is irrational and not having the armory filled up and ready to defend yourself and your faith.
Yeah, well, that's actually one of the slogans. Faith is irrational. So you know what I would say if you said that in a conversation? My first move, hey, what do you mean by faith? And why do you think it's irrational? Just start with the question. I think so many people get so defensive that they're like, oh, let me prove to you exactly. No. Just what do you mean by faith? Because a lot of people, when they say that, they have a very negative and deficient, and perhaps it's even because they were told when they were growing up, like, don't eat, don't ask questions, just believe, just do this, don't question anything, which is not the Catholic view. And if they were told that, we should apologize to them. Like, I'm sorry that that's the answers that you were given, because that's not what the Catholic tradition is all about. We believe we should engage our faith, but I would say, hey, what do you mean by faith, and why do you think it's irrational? And they're probably going to say, oh, it's just like a blind, naive gullibility, just believing any old thing with no evidence at all. And you see how it constantly points back to that no evidence objection. But I would say two reasons I like to give. So after they explain what they think faith is, to explain the Catholic perspective, I just give two principles that you should remember on faith. One, why faith is not irrational. Well, faith, we'll just put it simply as faith is the theological virtue by which we believe God and trust in him. It's the theological virtue by which we believe God and trust in him. That's just straight out of the catechism, stuff like that. But the reason it's not irrational is because, one, God willed that motives of credibility should accompany divine revelation. What do we mean by that phrase, motives of credibility? Well, things like miracles, prophecies, and the endurance and holiness of the church herself. And the crown miracle that everyone always points to is, we don't just believe the Bible out of nowhere, but Jesus, who walked the earth 2,000 years ago, we actually have really strong evidence that he rose from the dead and vindicated his claim. So we have that miracle that we point to. So that's one of the things. And you can point to other miracles and other prophecies or things. Some people are really moved by the saints and Mother Teresa and their holiness, and that could be a motive of credibility. So that's one reason it's not irrational. And the second reason is we actually believe God's grace moves us interiorly to assist us in making the act of faith. So it's not just us working on our own. If God exists, and we have good reasons that he does, we're actually in a relationship, and he's going to supply us with his grace to help us to believe. And that's why I think in the Gospels, when the man prays, like, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, our faith is not, it doesn't mean that we have no difficulties at all. It just means that when we have those difficulties, we're going to bring them to the Lord, and we're going to have a trusting relationship with him because we have good reasons to believe that he's there, and we've committed ourselves to him over time. But those are a couple things I would emphasize in the faith is irrational slogan, because that's the one that comes up a lot.
Yeah. I would have been one of those people to say that years ago. But I want to circle back to what you had mentioned at the beginning about prayer. I mean, even if you give people wonderful reasons to believe all this stuff, that it's true and we have good reason for it, it's not irrational, we do have proof for it. I think it's really important because we can get so discouraged that we aren't seeing the results that we would like to see, or we feel that our arguments should merit, that it does come down to, we can lead a person there. We can be that pebble in their shoe, like you said, but it really is the Holy Spirit that's going to have to convert a person. Absolutely.
And that's why prayer is so important. And even for ourselves too, like we need to be constantly reconverted. And honestly, prayer is something I'm still not good at. And that's kind of why we need to do it, because we're not good at it and we want to get better at it. And I put a plug in for the Pat Flynn show when he had Father Gregory Pine on. They did a great analysis of prayer and how to get started. But people, I'll just add this final point. People say experiencing God. When they hear that, like, how do you experience God and so forth? They're picturing like wild visions and voices and all this stuff of the divine. In the Catholic tradition, experiencing God does not require wild and crazy visions and voices. It can be done through ordinary phenomena experienced through the right cognitive lens when we trust in God. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm talking about quiet time with the Lord when we're reading scripture. I'm talking about setting aside maybe 15, 20, 30 minutes a day when we're going to praise the Lord, when we're going to tell him about our sins. We're going to say we're sorry for our sins. There's like an acronym that I learned when I was little that I still love. It's called it's ACTS, ACTS. Adoration, contrition. Those are the first two things you do. Then you're going to thank God, maybe 3 things from the day you're going to thank him for. And then supplication, or it's just your petitions, things you're actually going to ask him for. And over time, you're just going to find your relationship will grow, even when it's dry. Because I'll tell you what, I do actually have, when I was younger, I have some, I think some stronger religious experience and things that I did experience. But nowadays, a lot of times it's just dry. My prayer time, like I don't feel anything crazy. I don't hear anything crazy, but doing that daily act of commitment with the Lord can just draw you closer to him. And if you have someone who is having difficulties with the faith, encourage them not just to investigate the intellectual side, but also encourage them to take it to prayer. Because you can find this all over the Old Testament. You know, the Hebrews and the Jews, they were not perfect. They were constantly struggling with God. In the New Testament as well. Encourage them to take those struggles and difficulties to prayer, because he can do way better than we can do in a conversation. So I'll just leave you with that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I know Pat likes to mention how, but while he was converting, he started to pray the agnostic's prayer. So even if you're dealing with somebody who is not a believer yet, you can say, hey, you can pray, God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Get that started, because that might be just the little opening that God needs to start to work within you, or within the person, I should say.
I totally agree. No, I think that's got to be the starting point, and it could be conditional, like you said. You could say, "Hey, God, if you're there, please forgive me for this, and please help me with this, such and such," and you go into it.
Yeah, you don't have to be completely 100%. Or the person that you're, dealing with, as if they go through this conversion of heart process. I mean, they don't have to be 100% there from the very beginning. Certainly, I'm hoping that even just living my life as a Catholic now and being very strong and sure about my faith is going to help others convert, and even in my own family.
Absolutely. And I'll let me just say this to encourage folks. I have another tip in the introduction, that apologetics is most useful to people who are already open to truths of faith. So don't have way too high of expectations. You can't expect you're going to go out there and just convert someone on the street in 30 seconds. It just doesn't happen. It'll happen when someone is already open. And how do they get open? Well, they get open by little things here and there over time. And then the Holy Spirit can keep working and one day, hopefully, bring them into full communion with the faith. But yeah, don't put too much stress on yourself to think that you just have to run out there. I've been using this analogy lately, like apologetics. I have the sword of Gryffindor and I know exactly what to say, and I'm going to cut my enemies to pieces. That's not how it works. So have reasonable expectations, humble expectations, pray, ask some good questions, and then offer folks, some more things for consideration, and show them by the way you live that there really is something to Catholicism.
Yeah. All such good advice. I'm actually doing, I'm in my third go round of a St. Monica novena, praying for the conversion of someone. And there's one line in there that just says, grant me the grace to accept his will in all things. So here I'm praying, I'm asking you to convert this person, but really it boils down to you and that person.
I love it.
It's because we can't all do it ourselves, but I love that you're emphasizing prayer too, because that is so important, and it really shows that it's not all on us to know exactly what to say and when to say it, but just through having some good conversation starters and actually just good advice on how to have a good conversation, it can go such a long way.
And that's my hope. That's my hope for the book, that everyone picks up a copy. Yes, no, they're not going to know how to slay everyone who doesn't believe, but they're going to know how to start a conversation with a skeptic and be able to have a more productive and effective conversation that hopefully shows the goodness of Catholic Christian ideas. That's my hope for this book.
It's a very noble goal. So, okay, where can people find the book? When-ish can they find the book, and where can they catch up with you and your podcast and work?
Sure. So classicaltheism.com. They can find out my podcast, which focuses more on the apologetics and the philosophy, and I have a lot of great professors who have come on. And then to grab the book, it's set to be out June 15th, and you can head to classicaltheism.com/new book. And if it's not quite out on June 15th, then hopefully it'll be shortly around then. And I have some bonuses to offer folks if they're interested at the website. You can hop on my email list, and I have some bonuses to offer you. But yeah, classicaltheism.com/new book.
Awesome. And this is through Catholic Answers, correct?
That's correct.
Awesome. I just finished reading a book by Father Mitch Pacwa about...
he's so good.
He is good. And I didn't realize that he had been steeped in the New Age for quite a bit in his early priesthood. And that's kind of where I came from before I went into atheism. And so I was reading about his perspective and really how to... why the New Age stuff is incorrect. Because again, there's a lot of times I know it's wrong, but how do I articulate that? So I was like, I'll go to somebody who's already done the articulating for me. But it's funny because this book was written in 1991, I think. So all of the resources in the back are little PO boxes. So the Catholic Answers. It's
my gosh! Well, hey, that's where there's a division of labor. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's where there's a division of labor, because I wouldn't know where to go to answer a lot of those objections and things about New Age. I would have to go to you and your podcast and Mitch Paco. So it's great that Father Paco and you and people are doing all different kinds of stuff out there in the Catholic world.
Right, because the devil attacks it from all different sorts of angles. So we need, not everybody's going to be, you can't be everything to everybody in every objection, unless, I'm sure there are geniuses out there who can do that. I'm not one of them. So I'm so glad that you got to come on and talk a little bit more about, and it's always good to talk about the apologetic side of things. And my listeners don't just hear it from my husband and get to hear other perspectives on it, because it's such that was one of the things that really drew me in. I'm not an apologetics expert by any means, but just to know that there are so many very smart people from modern times all the way back when who have tackled these objections and issues that have cropped up, and still the church goes on. And I take such comfort in that.
Me too. No, absolutely. I'm not an apologetics expert either. I just have tons of experts on the show, and I happen to like it a lot myself. And I've compiled a lot of their great answers that you speak of, because we have a really great tradition that we can draw from. And the chances are, if you've heard an objection, it's been offered somewhere before. So Don't panic if you don't know the answer. You could say, hey, you know what? I'm not sure. It's a great point. I'm going to find out, and I'll look it up, and then I'll get back to you. So,
and they can go to your website and ask you questions too.
Absolutely. I invite all the questions.
Awesome. So I will put everything that you just said, I'll put a link in the show notes for everybody listening, so you can catch up with John on his website. And that's awesome. I'm excited about the book. Thank you again, John. And until next time, everyone. Don't forget to head over to thecatholicmama.com to get your free copy of How to Talk to Your Kids About God. This handy little ebook will teach you how to broach the topic of God with your children, or how to respond to your kids when they want to talk about God, as well as give you answers to 7 of the trickiest questions about the faith that Christian parents face. You'll love the easy-to-understand grown-up answers, the pared-down but not talked-down answers you can share with your kids, plus recommended resources if you'd like to deepen your understanding of the topic. Get yours free at thecatholicmama.com.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.